On this snowy evening in North Carolina, I welcome you back to the newest season of Ask Dr. Mia. Before we get on to talking about memory loss and dementia and this new episode, I want to introduce a concept called the dual state, which is the state that we are currently living in, originally coined by a German Jewish political scientist and labor lawyer named Ernst Frankl, who wrote this book called The Dual State after watching Hitler's rise to power. His main point is that a lot of what we're living in is really quite normal and a little bit boring at times. There's also another reality where things are definitely not normal. Part of what took me a little while to get back into podcast recording this season is reconciling what I consider the normal part of podcast recording with the not normal timeline that we're all living in the United States. That's where you're listening from. I think that to me, it's important to say that aging and dementia care, it is very political, even if you may not consider it a political topic, because the way that society treats older adults is a direct reflection on the character of the country or the society that we live in. And if we think about how we treat our elders in this country, I don't need to tell you that the character of how we treat our elders for a lot of people, not everyone, could be improved. And we will be talking about new research and different ways of understanding Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. I can't help but mention that so much of the research that I'm able to report on has been funded by the National Institute on Aging and the National Institute on Health. And I am certainly not alone in knowing and having a grant funding that's either paused or not progressed, or know of colleagues who are in funding gaps. So I think for anyone who is listening and understanding how policies may affect how we all age, I hope you can take some small action in your own day that make your future grandchildren be proud of the person you are today. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and let me know through email or text with the link in the show notes any other ideas and topics you would like for me to cover on this season of Ask Dr. Mia podcast. Welcome to Ask Dr. Mia, Answers on Dementia Caregiving. I am your pocket geriatrician and memory specialist. When I was helping my mom with her cancer journey, I knew I wanted to be her advocate and her care partner. But I didn't expect to have to rehash old patterns of communication like a teenager. Combining my knowledge as a specialist for older adults and my own experience as a sandwich generation care partner, I am here to empower you to take practical steps to not only care for the older adult in your life, but also take good care of yourself. Welcome. One idea about Alzheimer's disease that a lot of people don't know is that in the past 5 to 10 years, there has been really changing definition of the word Alzheimer's. Traditionally, Alzheimer's diagnosis was one of exclusion, meaning after we ruled out someone as having strokes, deficiencies in certain vitamins like vitamin B12, or having low thyroid, ruling out any acute or recent infections, medication side effects, psychiatric illness like really severe depression or anxiety that affects memory and thinking. If we cannot find a reason that could explain someone's memory loss, then we called it Alzheimer's disease or probable Alzheimer's disease. But really, when Dr. Alzheimer's discovered or coined the term Alzheimer's disease, it was based on pathology, based on what was happening in a patient and in her brain after she had passed away in a psychiatric unit, and looking at the plaques and the tangles in her brain and named that disease Alzheimer's. So the traditional way of diagnosing was that symptoms of what people have in terms of short-term memory loss that can progress to other behavioral or mood changes and becoming more dependent on other people in terms of activities of daily living, starting with some of the more complicated ones that we all need to do to be independent adults, such as driving, managing finances, managing a complicated medication regimen, or if you're working, usually the things you do at work are oftentimes the most cognitively challenging. So the traditional diagnosis for Alzheimer's disease really confounded another two terms and used it very interchangeably. Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's dementia. I think when most people who are not memory specialists think about Alzheimer's, they think of Alzheimer's dementia, meaning someone who is perhaps in a more severe stage of the disease, needing a lot of help, having lost a great deal of autonomy over their life, and potentially even feel like a burden to their families. But dementia is not the same as the disease. If we catch the disease early enough, people are not yet fulfilling the definition of having dementia, meaning they're still independent in most of their activities of daily living, like the ones I mentioned earlier. But they do have not normal aspects of memory changes going on in their brain. So the more recent, newer diagnosis of Alzheimer's went back into diagnosing based on pathology, based on the plaques, also called the amyloid protein in the brain. And this is how Dr. Alzheimer's originally coined a term based on the plaques going on in the brain. What makes this definition different is that people may have slightly different symptoms on the outside. Classically, the symptoms for Alzheimer's disease starts with short-term memory problems that progress to affect all different types of memory and trouble with memory and thinking, but their underlying pathology is the same. And I think this really escalated over the past 2 years when we have newer Alzheimer's drugs that remove the amyloid protein or the amyloid plaques from the brain. So it was important to distinguish those who have amyloid and have a biological or pathological definition of Alzheimer's disease from others who may look like they're having a same disease presentation but don't have elevated amyloid or don't have a high amount of plaques in their brain. What we think is the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease is that there is a buildup of amyloid for probably decades before the symptoms start. We think that the buildup of these plaques cause the synapse or the spaces between neurons to start to function abnormally. This orange line, for those who might be watching this on YouTube, after the plaques or the amyloid builds up is when we think that another protein called tau or tau tangles start to build up within the cells of the brain or the neurons. And the tau is really what causes injury to the cells of the neurons, cells of the brain. And that's really what changes from preclinical, meaning no symptoms, to having symptoms, which the earliest symptoms are due to classified as mild cognitive impairment, meaning people have objective and oftentimes subjective reports of memory loss, but they are still independent in their activities. As the disease progresses, we start entering into the stage of dementia, like I said. So people are having loss of their independence, starting very mild in the beginning, but progresses over time to be more severe. The brain structure, which is really what we see on MRI, may not change until fairly late in the buildup of the amyloid plaques and the tau tangles. Memory and clinical function, or how people are doing on a daily basis, also is one of the later changes, because some people may have a lot of what's called cognitive reserve. Their high intellect or their training from doing very cognitively stimulating jobs over many years have built up a really high level baseline that has to be slowly worn down to the point of noticing having trouble with things like financial management. Although we call Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's dementia the most common type of dementia, the reality is that it's actually really complicated. When we look at what we have traditionally defined as Alzheimer's disease, it is actually a mix of the plaques and the tangles, as well as changes to the blood vessel or vascular disease in the brain. When we think about the overlap between Alzheimer's disease and vascular disease or vascular dementia, there is probably a 70% overlap between the two, meaning 70% of the time we would see both amyloid plaques in the brain as well as small or moderate changes to people's small blood vessels in the brain as we age, in many ways due to chronic high blood pressure, hypertension, high cholesterol, diabetes, the chronic illnesses that are very common as we get older. On the other two sides of these two overlapping circles, one is pure Alzheimer's disease. This is where you really only primarily have the plaques and the tangles driving the disease and not so much the blood vessels themselves. Sometimes we see this in people who have a very strong family history. They may have a genetic type called ApoE4, which is the E4 allele on a gene called ApoE, and that can lead to the buildup or the lack of clearance of the amyloid plaques in the brain. On the other side, in people who have purely vascular dementia, oftentimes these are people who have had multiple strokes, and that the strokes are the reason why people have memory changes. But most of the time, this is all overlapping. And even in diseases like Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia, there may still be overlap of these amyloid plaques and tau tangles. The word dementia and the word mild cognitive impairment are both umbrella terms. They describe the symptoms that people have, but they don't really explain what is the underlying cause. So there could be Alzheimer's disease causing memory changes, or vascular disease, or other more rare types of dementia that I'm not going to go into today, which is why the abbreviation ADRD, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, are oftentimes looped together, bundled together when we talk about it from a public health and policy perspective. But when it comes to an individual person, someone who is, say, 75 may have both a combination of Alzheimer's disease due to the amyloid plaques and the tau tangles, and small vessel disease causing symptoms. And this is why treatments and ways of preventing Alzheimer's can get really complicated. What I want us to go back and remember that what we traditionally have called Alzheimer's is not how we call Alzheimer's today. And I think this is causing a lot of confusion when you read reports of studies as well as different news reports about research that come out about how common this is. And I think this is also why some of the new drugs that treat only the amyloid plaques may not be the right drug for people who have a significant amount of vascular disease, because these anti-amyloid drugs can cause increased risk of bleeding from these small blood vessels. After this episode, I hope you understand the changing definition of Alzheimer's disease from a diagnosis of exclusion to a disease defined by its biomarkers, amyloid plaques and tau tangles. But I hope you also know that disease is not the same as dementia, and that dementia marks a notable change in someone's independence in their daily activities, while the disease may be underlying and changing throughout the years, from very, very mild symptoms to the point of having dementia. And I hope you also know that the causes of Alzheimer's disease is very varied and encompasses more than amyloid, especially when we're thinking about the traditional definition of Alzheimer's, where it probably looked the same on the outside, but were caused by different things on the inside. And there's a lot more that we have yet to discover about Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Thank you for listening. Talk to you next time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please click the follow button on your favorite podcast platform. Please remember that this is educational content and that do talk to your own doctor if you have specific questions. Original music by Grant Willis. And the podcast is edited by Builder Librarian. And finally, please repeat after me. By taking care of myself, I can better care for the older adult in my life.